Welcome, everyone, to another fabulous episode of The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming, as always, on a mighty blaze on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and all the places where you receive your internet goodness. We are here every Tuesday at 2 to see what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And one of my favorite topics, actually, in books is books with giant heart. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today because who better to talk about such books, and indeed, who better to write such books than my guest today, Matthew Quick. But before we get to Matthew, a few words. A Mighty Blaze, as you know, is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers during COVID and beyond. At A Mighty Blaze, we are never asking for money. If you want to support us, we are 100% virtual. Just like us on social media or subscribe or tell your friends about us. As I said, all that content is completely and utterly free. But, if you are in the mood to spend money, please spend it on books meant to uplift our faith in human nature. Books that explore how to navigate even the worst of human trauma. Books written with charm, humor, and compassion, and which discuss how we always have it within us to bind together, heal our wounds, and rebuild our lives. Books like We Are the Light by Matthew Quick. Regarding questions, if you want to ask Matthew anything at all, please just pop it in the chat and we'll get to it at the end of the show. And now on to our guest. Matthew Quick is the New York Times bestselling author of The Silver Linings Playbook, which was made, of course, into the David O. Russell Oscar-winning film with Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper. He is also the author of 8 other novels, some YA, some for adults. Matthew's work has been translated into more than 30 languages. He received a Penn Hemingway honorable mention. He was an LA Times Book Prize finalist, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a #1 bestseller in Brazil, and The Hollywood Reporter named him one of Hollywood's 25 most powerful authors. He lives with his wife, the novelist Alicia Bissett, on North Carolina's Outer Banks. And as for his latest work, We Are the Light, which comes out today, it explores Jungian psychology, grief, and healing in the aftermath of a mass shooting in a small town. The Washington Post said the book was, quote, timely, relevant, and ripped from the headlines. In this epistolary novel, the author asks and answers, how does a person who experienced such profound loss become whole again? Matthew, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, Mark.
It's such a treat. I love the book. There's so much to dig into. This is going to be an amazing 45 minutes. But first, Matthew, we are a social media platform and we broadcast on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, all that stuff. But you are not on social media. And so I just have to ask off the bat, why is that? Is there a kind of philosophy behind that, or just you don't have time, or what is it?
I had a very strange relationship with social media for a long time. I'm very much an introvert. And so whenever I go online, I just feel like I'm being overwhelmed with information. So I never really liked it. And then after my last book tour, The Reason You're Alive, I came home and I decided that I needed to start working towards like really getting sober. And so part of that was breaking away from a lot of things in the past, just to take some time to figure out who I was and what I wanted. And I didn't find that social media is a real great place for figuring out who you are or what you want. It feels like a great place to figure out what everyone else wants you to be.
Right.
So I don't have anything. I don't have an axe to grind with social media. I just felt that for me, it was not a healthy place to be. And when I signed with Avid Reader Press, one of the first things Jofi said to me in an interview, he's like, we're not going to make you get on social media. I'm like, this is the place for me. I think, yes, you're the only publisher who's ever said that to me. I wanted to give him a hug.
That's really cool. And Avid Reader Press, such a cool press. They've been doing such great stuff. I mean, I've done a lot of authors from Avid Reader Press on my show, and they just seem to really have their finger on the pulse.
Yeah, I'm loving it there. My editor's been great. Jofi Ferrari Adler has been amazing. So it's been a really good experience with them.
Beautiful. Well, look, before we get into the book itself, let's talk a little bit about the background of the book. Obviously you started your career in this incredible kind of almost Cinderella way, and we'll maybe talk about some of that later in the interview. Just this incredible success right out of the gate. And then you went on to start writing YA books, and those were successful too. But when you talk about this book, I read in your acknowledgments, I just want to read something that you wrote in your acknowledgments.
Sure.
This book was written at the tail end of a tremendously dark period of my life, a severe writer's block, which humbled and humiliated me. Now, I think people who read that, even though you're always humble about your own work and your own success, I think people who see that from someone like Matthew Quick might think, oh, how is that possible? I mean, he's had movies made out of his work. He's been a bestseller, all these things. But even you can run into an extended period of writer's block. Talk to us about that.
Well, I was someone who never believed in writer's block. Very arrogantly, I thought that, plumbers don't get plumber's block, all those lines you hear. I thought you sit down and you're right. That's what you do. But then, of course, writer's block happens to you. I also used to be a writer who said, don't trust novelists who don't drink. That was a motto of mine, never trust. And then I became a novelist who doesn't drink, so I got sober, and it was difficult. I had to relearn how to do a lot of things in life without alcohol. And I found that, as someone who drank regularly on a daily basis for 25 years, getting sober meant becoming a completely different person. And it also, alcohol was also something that I used to deal with my anxiety, to treat my anxiety. It was a way for me to feel okay out in public. But I also think too, writing fiction with an open heart, requires a lot of courage. And so I think at the end of the day, there was always that escape into oblivion. And without that, the leap into fiction writing became a little scarier, I think. At the time, I wasn't conscious of that. At the time, I just thought, I just got to bull my way through, or my well's dry. Ego really wanted to fix this problem on its own. But it wasn't until I entered into Jungian analysis that I realized that psyche, or my soul, was shutting me down because I needed to go through this transformative process. And I think part of it too was entering into the second half of life. This happened right around 44, 45. And I did not want to change. I wanted to write novels like I did when I was 30 years old, which meant, mainlining caffeine all day and drinking all night and, working 12 hours a day. And my body couldn't keep up with that. And I wasn't that person anymore. And so I had to relearn how to be a novelist in my late 40s, and to do that without alcohol and prescription medication and other things as well. So it was a really humbling experience. And I think another thing that I learned too was I'd always been kind of a lone wolf type character. I can do this on my own, come from kind of a blue collar background. And I had been talking about mental health openly and encouraging other people to go out and get the help that they need, particularly men. I was very open about my anxiety and depression, but I was really, my dark secret was that I was not getting the help that I needed. I was encouraging everyone else to do that, but it wasn't until I was 46 that I actually, reached out and got the help that I need, which turned out to be Jungian analysis for me. So there was a lot going on. And I think that I don't know that I could have written through that in real time. I think I needed a pause. I needed to take a break to figure out what was going on, and also to deal with a lot of things that I hadn't dealt with my whole life, because alcohol is a numbing agent. So all of the pain that I've had since a young man, all of the emotional things going on inside of me, I just deadened all of that with alcohol for so long. And so when I stopped drinking, the feelings inside of me were so intense and so overwhelming that it took a while for me to even acclimate to what it feels like not to be putting alcohol into your body every single night, and to feel your own real feelings. And so that was a bit of an exploration as well. And so I think it was a little bit of a wake-up call for me, and a little bit of a moment where I said, I've got to start being who I really am. I've got to find out who the real Matthew Quick is. And I think the novels that I wrote before that, they are me, but I think I've gone to a deeper place with this book. And I think the work that I'm doing now it's more sober, and I think it's more me at the core, I would say.
Wow. I mean, there's no question about the realness of this book. And this is a book about the most serious topic, frankly, one can imagine. And you don't pull punches. And yet somehow it contains all your humor, all your tenderness, even
Thank you.
though it's it's almost an unbearable reality that these characters are going through. But before we get into the book talks a lot about Jungian psychology.
Mhm.
And the main character, the form of the book is him writing a letter to his Jungian psychologist or analyst. Can you, for those who might not know what this is, and I'm sure this is the kind of topic that, thousands of books have been written about, so it's hard for you to sum it up in 47 seconds or less, but just give us an introduction to what is Jungian psychology, just because it's so important both to you personally and to this book.
Yeah, so it's based on the ideas of Carl Jung, who was a psychotherapist, in the last century. And as he's quite astutely pointed out, he's written dozens and dozens of books, and there are other people have written about it. But the thing that really attracted me to Jung a while ago, but then to enter into analysis, was the idea that unlike Freud or Adler, he really thinks about the unconscious. He thinks about what are the things that are going on in the world that we're not conscious of or that we're blind to. He also was a big proponent of story as medicine. So I think as a novelist, he's very appealing. Jungian analysis involves dream analysis. So we treat dreams like we would a novel if we were interpreting them symbolically. So really what it is a deep dive into who you are. And the goal of Jungian analysis is called individuation. And what that means is to find who you were meant to be when you were born, before all of the problems and all of the stress and all of the worries and all of the schooling and what your parents did or didn't do to you or taught you. But who are you at the core? Like, what is that spark of life in you? And how does it want to come forth into this world? And that's really the goal of Jungian analysis, to figure that out. The other thing I really like about it is that it's less interested in dealing with the symptoms and rather going to the core of things. My analyst is less interested in removing my anxiety or depression than he is in understanding what it's trying to tell us. And so I remember early on in my analysis saying to him, 2 or 3 months in, being very frustrated and saying, "I'm not writing. Why haven't you fixed this? Why? When are we going to be done? When I'm working really hard." And I remember he just sat there and he pondered for a second. He said, "Well, that's really interesting that you think you can do this in 4 months." And I said, because I know he had been through analysis. I said, "How long did it take you?" He said, 20 years. And I said, "Oh, okay." Like, this is not a quick fix. This is, and Jung himself, my analyst has told me many times, he would say that not everybody's a candidate for Jungian analysis because it requires you to go through what he would call an alchemical process that breaks you down into nothing before it builds you back up. And that process can be extremely painful. And there are times when I would get done a session and I literally couldn't stand up out of the chair because of the heaviness of the emotional work that you're doing. So that is kind of a brief overview of Jungian analysis. There's much more to it than that.
And I am tempted to go deep on it because I love Carl Jung, and I mostly know Carl Jung for his ideas about the collective unconscious, and
Yeah.
as a forerunner to kind of the monomyth and our shared, human psychology and mythology. But I really want to talk about this book.
Yeah.
So, and also in this book, there's a lot more about Jungian psychology. So, for anybody who reads this book, you're going to get your fill of that. But to start with, We Are the Light. Just why don't you give us the thumbnail sketch of the book in your own words?
Well, We Are the Light is about a man named Lucas Goodgame. And Lucas Goodgame, unfortunately, experiences this horrific tragedy in a movie house where there's a shooting. And he loses his wife. And 16 other people besides his wife are unfortunately killed. And when he comes out of the tragedy, everybody has hailed him as a hero. Everyone except for him. He doesn't believe that he's a hero. And the first thing that happens when he gets out of the movie house is he wants to connect with his analyst, and his analyst decides that he is no longer practicing because he was affected by the tragedy as well. So Lucas rather heroically decides that he's going to try to woo his analyst back into his life. And so he starts writing these letters to his analyst, asking him, will you please re-engage with me, but also telling what's going on with his life. And so through these letters, we see how Lucas's psyche, or his soul, keeps his mind from fracturing completely. It comes up with this kind of beautiful philosophy, this beautiful story that you know is a little absurd and is not all there, but it's something that's very important to Lucas to keep him together. Very early on in the book, a young man by the name of Eli, whom Lucas was counseling at the local high school, is also affected by the tragedy because his brother was the shooter, and the whole town has kind of ostracized him and scapegoated him, wrongly so. He sets up a tent in Lucas's backyard, and Eli kind of forces Lucas into this relationship where they decide that they're going to create this art project that they imagine will save themselves and the entire town. And so as the book unfolds, we see how Lucas and Eli present this to the town and ultimately get them to engage in this art project.
And the form of the book is an epistolary novel. And I think epistolary novels are really interesting. And for those who might not know that term, that just means the form of the novel is letters being written. And in this case, it's only letters from Lucas to his psychologist. One of the things that I like about epistolary novels is that I find that writing often achieves a level of intimacy and precision and ultimately expression when the audience for the writing is really clear. Now, sometimes the audience for writing is the audience of the book, and like the reader, right? But I think like a kind of shortcut to creating a level of intimacy and creating precision in tone is to have letter writings or emails or what have you, just because to the fictional character, to him or her, the audience is very clear. And I think some of that is going on here. So that's just one observation about the epistolary form, but kind of curious for your take on why was this the right form for this novel?
Well, I didn't choose this form. This form chose me. And I was blocked for a very, very long time, about 3.5 years, where I was sitting down every single day for 8 hours. And sometimes I couldn't even put together a sentence. A year would go by and I'd have 10 pages and I would show them to my wife, who's also a novelist, Alicia Bissett, and she would have tears in her eyes because they were so bad. Like, and she was so worried for me that, you know, she didn't understand what had happened to me. So along the way, she had suggested that I write another novel in letters, and I didn't want to do it. I had written The Good Luck Right Now as an epistolary novel, and I felt like I had already done it. And then a year later, without knowing that Alicia had already suggested it, my buddy, the writer Nicholas Butler, he said the same thing. He said, you know, dude, you can write letters to me, you can write letters to your friend, like you write really nice letters. So, you know, if you can't write a novel, why don't you write a novel in letters? Because that's the thing that you can write. And so once he seconded that, and this is after a year of analysis too, I went up and typed Dear Carl, and then it was like, whew, like it just the floodgates opened, and it was the only way that I could do it. So my analyst would say that, you know, psyche or soul chose that for you. Like this is the way that it had to happen, and I believe that. But I do think that there's something very intimate about observing two people communicating. And even with Lucas, it's really him writing. So it's kind of a one-way communication, but it's this relationship between these two men that is very intimate because of the analysis. And so you get to eavesdrop on that. And the other thing too that's really interesting is it's almost like an analytical session. So Lucas is bearing his soul to his analyst. So we get to analyze him in real time. And because of that, I play around with dramatic irony because the audience knows much more than Lucas knows. Like you figure things out before he's figuring them out in real time, which is painful because we have to sit with that knowledge. And I mean, pain, it's like heartbreaking. It's painful in the best of ways that we see this man trying so hard, but he's in this fantasy. And part of what I've learned through Jungian analysis is that sometimes when people are in a fantasy, that's like a Band-Aid or a band. It's like
Mm.
and you don't want to puncture that fantasy prematurely. It's like a womb, like they're kind of a chrysalis, that they're kind of reforming in that. And so as the town of Majestic is holding Lucas's psyche in this very fragile way, his fantasy in this very fragile way, the audience, the reader, gets to hold that as well. So in some ways, we are playing caretaker, analysts, and we get to see this man at his most vulnerable, and we get to hold that for him, which I think is a great gift.
One of the biggest points I think the book is making, or one of the main things you explore, is this idea of art and imagination as a critical part of the healing process. I think it's sort of so beautifully rendered in this book, this idea that, for example, Lucas, the main character, sees angels, okay? And a central part of the plot of the book is the making of a film. And I think the book is really exploring the idea that, like, art making, visions, religious sentiment, fantasy, as you just said, these are all sort of, far from being like an aspect of mental illness, as someone might say. They're actually like the toolbox of the psyche to kind of insulate itself and process an unbearable reality.
Yes. Yeah. And there's an idea that's not mine, and I believe Jung believed this too, that, when we took the gods out of our stories, they showed up in us as neuroses and sickness. So the Greeks had the gods, and that's where the psychic drama took place. But once you don't have those stories, and in the 20th century, as we let go of religion, all of that psychic energy has to go somewhere. So how does it show up? It shows up sometimes as anxiety. It shows up as depression. It shows up in various different ways. And so I think that what Lucas is really dealing with is this horrific tragedy that he cannot find a way to wrap his mind around it. So he needs a narrative. He needs a story. And, we could call that a fantasy. We could call that a delusion, or we could call that a miracle. That his psyche comes up with a story that gets him through this rough time period. And, this idea of his wife coming to him as an angel, I've really been thinking about this a lot. I was interviewed on the podcast, This Jungian Life, last week. It's a great podcast. Just check it out. And it just came to me. I never thought about this before, but Lucas has this very tough struggle relationship with his mother. He has a very complex relationship with the feminine. And Jung would say he has a mother complex. And when Darcy comes into his life, his wife, she really helps him with that, because she's this great feminine character, his wife. And when she's radically taking away from him in such a traumatic way, he makes her into almost a goddess. She becomes a divine feminine for him, and she counsels him, and she visits him with angel wings. And this is something that in the novel I think is beautiful, but I also think it's medicinal. It's something that his soul needs. It needs this at this time. It needs this feminine healing energy. And his mind creates this for him, which is miraculous.
Right. I think that this, to me, was like the most fascinating aspect of the book. This connection between art making and story making, and the psychic necessity of that for the human soul, or the psyche. And I just love, as an artist myself, and I think I've heard you say this about kind of growing up in Philadelphia, and kind of how art, if you're from a certain background, can seem frivolous, and art can seem unnecessary or a luxury. And I think sort of one of the most salient points being made here is just the absolute inescapable psychic necessity of art making, storytelling, fantasy, to process some of the grimmer truths about life. And on that note, I thought the structure of the book was outstanding. I thought the ending was just so incredible, because, without giving away any spoilers,
thank you for that.
for sure, don't worry, because there's so many great reveals, and it's not like thriller reveals or like, mystery story reveals. It's like, these are like just profound reveals that sort of show the psychology of the main character, and they make sense of everything that came before. And I think, like, sort of that's one of the big mysteries, and you've alluded to this already in this interview. One of the big mysteries is sort of, what did really happen, and
Yeah.
what is truth and what's not. And you have this device of an unreliable narrator that we pick up on as the reader, that Lucas sort of, the pieces don't seem to be fitting together, but you're left wondering why. And then at the end of the story, all the puzzle pieces do fit together. And I think the message there is really like, look, this was an unbearable reality. The mind was not ready. His
Yeah.
mind was not ready to absorb what happened. And
Yeah.
so he was buffered, as you say. So this is all just a way of me complimenting the kind of how the structure was so integral to what you were saying about psychology.
Yeah. And I also think too, going back to just why do we need story? And the theater in Majestic is described as almost like a cathedral. And I've often thought of movie houses as a place where you go to find the transcendent. You know, we all go into a dark room and we sit there quietly and we gaze up at this light that's bigger than us on the screen, like these godlike figures on the screen. Like, why are we going there? You know, and I think on some level it's easy just to say, well, we're going because we want to eat popcorn and drink Coca-Cola and, you know, numb out. And I think to some degree there is that. But I think that what we're searching for, whether we're putting on Netflix or HBO, whatever, you know, I could plug whatever here, or whether we're opening a novel, is that we want to find transcendence. We want to find something that feels larger than us. We want to fall in love. We want to feel emotions that we can't quite grasp, that we know are out there. And so this idea of the movie house being like a temple of story, and it's violated, sullied. And so the town has to reclaim that. They have to re-sanctify that space. They have to fight. And I think that is really important today, not only because the movie houses are closing, but I think we're really losing, you know, this idea of what should story do? You know, should story be something that changes our life, or is it just something that we numb out on, you know, and not take seriously? Of course, I'm in the former camp, you know, and that's what I'm pushing. But I think that when you talk to people about this, if you talk about it in the right way, you see a look in people's eye, like they're hungry for it. They're hungry for something more. Like, people want to break out of the numbness of their day-to-day life. They know that there's more out there. And I think that that's what this story is about. It's about seeing the sanctity, you know, the sacredness of story, and celebrating that and fighting for it to keep it alive.
Beautifully said. I want to talk about what I see in your larger body of work. I mean, to draw on one example, I just rewatched Silver Linings Playbook last night. Of course, read the book. They are different from each other. But I did have like an hour and a half to spare on Halloween night, and so I watched that movie. But there seems to be in your work, if you would allow me to kind of generalize, and you tell me if you agree or not, but your books, as I said in the introduction, have big heart. It's something that you are known for. And you also are always talking about mental illness, and you're trying to take that bull by the horns. It comes up again and again in your work. And I wonder if sometimes there seems to be a connection there, in the sense that, like, you know, the outsider, you know, the person maybe afflicted with some level of mental illness is also the person who's kind of able to see things clearly, is the person who's able to act with heart, and in some way kind of, this is really maybe too metaphorical a term, but kind of like a special person, or a seer type role. And I'm just wondering, without me bumbling on any more about that, I mean, do you see that connection in your work as like the connection between mental illness and the ability to live with an open heart and see things more clearly than the rest of us?
Yeah, I think that my extreme anxiety, which has led to depression, has forced me out of society as an outsider sometimes, you know, and I've taken myself out, you know, sometimes necessarily, but it has given me a unique point of view. And I think a lot about, you know, the idea of a wounded healer, and, you know, whether we're talking about the blind seer in Greek mythology that, you know, can see everything even though they're blind. I think that the wound is what gives you power. You know, every shaman is wounded before they become a shaman. And so I often think, I tell a funny story. There was once this librarian, she's really a sweet woman, and she came up to me and she said, my 12-year-old daughter wants to be a novelist. You know, I want to do everything I can to make sure my daughter's a novelist. You know, what can I do to help her on this journey? And I said to her, I said, if you do all those things, you will never be a novelist. I'm like, my father told me I was an idiot, and that's what made me a novelist. He told me it was the dumbest thing in the world, and he just trashed my dream and crushed me. And then it was like this wound that I was chasing my whole life, you know. And I tell that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I do think that all of my heroes that were novelists, you know, the guys I grew up reading, you know, be it Hemingway or Vonnegut or Bukowski, whoever, they're all profoundly broken men. And I think that's where the beauty came from, you know. And I always say that with my anxiety and my depression, I would not wish that on anyone. You know, I would, if I could wave a magic wand and take that away, I would. But I know that that's the engine of my work. And it's this longing. And for me, I've talked about this a lot, that my anxiety often puts me outside of community. It literally makes it hard for me to be around people a lot of times. But the thing that I want most in the world is to connect with people. And so holding the tension of those two opposites, like having this thing inside of me that takes me away from people, but desiring this connection, like that tension is what makes the art. Like that's what really makes it alive. And so my characters also are these people that they really want to connect with people. And they're people that have been hurt over and over, but they still are trying. And I think that that's what makes them human. I think that's what makes them lovable. And that's what makes them easy to root for, in my opinion. You know, it's the trying, even though it hurts to try. And I think that for me, when I go to fiction, that's always what I'm looking for. You know, that honest place where people are willing to be emotionally vulnerable and take that and try to do something beautiful with the pain of it.
You know, Matthew, another thing that I see in your work, and that frankly every single person sees also, is the big heart and the hope. And I mean, I know you've talked about how you want your books to maybe give people a little bit more faith in humanity, and, you know, have your books be about, you know, how people do show up for you sometimes, you know. And I had Mitch Albom on the show recently, and we're talking about his latest book, Stranger in the Lifeboat. And Mitch gave you a great blurb for this book too. Yeah. But, you know, Mitch was just talking about, you know, he's like, look, you know, I might not be the most critically acclaimed guy, you know, the literary circles may not like me because my book doesn't have like XYZ kind of very negative topic. But he's like, you know, he's like, the best moments in life are sentimental moments. You meet people and you say, what's your life about? They pull out a picture of their kids. And he says, you know, I want my books to be, when people need to be comforted, I want them to reach for my book. Now, I just think when I look at Mitch Albom selling 40 million books, and I look at all the success that you've had, and I look at someone like, say, like Matt Haig, author of The Midnight Library, a similar kind of hitting some similar notes sometimes. And I'm just like, isn't this what people want most of all, is books with big heart?
You know, I think there's all different types of audiences out there. And, you know, I love literary fiction. I read a lot of literary fiction. So a lot of stuff I read doesn't have, you know, the quote unquote big heart. But I do think that people read for different reasons. You know, I think sometimes when you read a literary novel, you want to have your brain tested, or you want to appreciate the poetry of the sentence. But I know that when I write, I'm usually trying to save myself in a way that is quite selfish, to be honest. You know, and I get ready for a book tour, I have a lot of anxiety. And so I've been writing furiously because that's the place where I feel safe. But the thing that happened early on in my career that I really didn't plan was that by trying to save myself through the writing, you accidentally save other people. And so it happened first with Silver Linings. I published this book that I was telling myself when I was writing. It was a book about football. You know, this is my football book, you know, because I wasn't brave enough to say, this is my mental health book. This is my coming out to the world as someone who suffers from depression and anxiety. It was my football book. And so, you know, I told all my friends that I used to go to the Eagles games with that they'll love it because it's a football book. And they read it and they were very supportive of me, but I think they were surprised because it's really not a football book. But one thing that did happen is some of them started to come to me and say, "Hey, man, I didn't know you were writing about this stuff, but me too. Like we've never talked
Mm.
about this, but I've been on meds for years, or I've been seeing a therapist for years." And so it became this like very strange vehicle for having these really intimate conversations with people that I knew for years, that like we were kind of out on the water in the dark and we didn't know that we were 5 feet away from each other. And so it became this like, wow, like the light came up. And then when I started writing these YA books, I just started thinking about, well, you know, what were the teenagers that I was teaching dealing with, and what was I dealing with when I was young? And then I started getting letters from kids, particularly from who have read my book, Forgive Me, Leonard Peacock. Um, I'll get letters that sometimes they come at like 3 a.m. in email and say, "I just found your book online. I read this book and I think it saved my life." And like, I don't share that, like, yay me. I share that because there are kids out there that need books that save their lives. And I always say to librarians and teachers that the book you hate might be the book that saves a kid's life.
Mm.
So you really need to be careful about how you talk about books with children, because the book you love might not be the right book for that kid. And so by writing these books that are trying to figure these things out, you find that you're casting light and you're illuminating the path for other people quite accidentally. So I always try to just write what's true and honest to me in a way that is illuminating and makes me feel better about, my own current reality, or what's going on. And in my experience, that's been good medicine for other people too. And I'm very grateful whenever that happens. And it's really profoundly moving when you can provide that for other people. Because when I first started writing, that was definitely not my intention at all.
I remember listening to an interview of yours where you were talking about like the 6 months leading up to the release of Silver Linings Playbook, the book, and how it dovetails with what you just said, that, here you were, you had, somehow managed to get David O. Russell interested in the project, and he's planning to make a movie already before your book comes out. And again, to a lot of writers, they would see that and think like, okay, man, bro has got it made in the shade. But the way you talk about that time is just such a dark time, because you were coming out at last from behind this MFA mask. You were coming out from behind your opinions about literature and your kind of, I think this is your word, your kind of snootier tastes. And here you were writing just something raw about who you are, about who the people you grew up with are. And I took a lot from that. And I just think it's an interesting lesson to writers coming up about taking off that mask and how scary that is, but how ultimately that's how you find your readers.
Yeah. And a lot of the stuff I was writing in my MFA program, it was inauthentic, and the teachers that I was working with are brilliant people. And, I'm very grateful for everything they taught me, but I was really trying to please them. I was basically saying, what's going to make these people happy? What's going to make, and that is definitely not the way to go. And I think, coming out is a strange word, but I really do think as a writer, you've got to figure out, who am I? And again, this goes on with the conversation about Jungian analysis. Who am I and what wants to come through me? And am I brave enough to put that out there? Because there will be a cost. And my analyst talks about this all the time. Like anything that you want to accomplish, anything that you want to do, there is always a cost for that. And I think the fantasy that many young writers have is that they're going to be able to be successful or to have some type of fame without paying any type of cost. The A-list celebrities that I had been around briefly, during the Oscars run, they were all paying an incredible cost. Like when you see them off camera, like it's a hard life. And I think that's the thing that that I didn't know that I was getting myself into, when I was putting out Silver Linings. I never thought anyone would publish it, let alone all the success. It was rejected by more than 70 agents. And I just kept going and going and going and going. And finally I found mine, and then everything took off. But then it was like, oh my God, like I did this, like everyone's going to read this. This is real. The fantasy was gone. And so it took me a while to acclimate to that. And it took me, I was very grateful. It was mind blowingly amazing. I realized how privileged I was. But then it was also, everybody's going to read this and everybody's going to talk about this. My parents are going to read this, and I hadn't talked about any of that stuff with anybody. So it was, especially as an introvert, as a writer who sits alone in a room and does this very intimate thing, to extrovert that can be very difficult for me. To take something that's very private and internal and give it to the world and then say, okay, how many stars do you give this? It's a very strange feeling, because those stars are rating like my soul, it's rating like who I was through this time period. And I realize it's a product. I understand the game, but there's a really steep learning curve, or at least was for me, to really get that on the soul level, like what I was doing. And I think in my early 30s, I just thought I'm going to be a writer, and I didn't understand what that meant or what it would cost. I always saw, what it could maybe get me, what ego wanted. And now here in my late 50s, I'm in my late 40s, excuse me, and I just turned 49. I think I have a more mature relationship to the writing and what I'm trying to do, and my process, what's coming out of me, and the costs, and the benefits of that too.
So I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go. We've had a bunch of audience questions. We'll go to those after this question. But
sure.
Last question for me is just about your origin story, which is a lot of what you just alluded to. But it's, to me, I was just talking to another writer friend of mine this morning about you, and I told him, your origin story, and he just loved it. And I just feel like even though you've talked about it a lot, I feel like it bears repeating, this idea that you were a high school teacher and then you just kind of hated your life, or like we're so stuck. And then you said to your wife, I want to be a writer. And she said, okay, well, let's just sell our house and move in with my parents. And then you just gave up everything and quit and wrote Silver Linings Playbook in the basement of your in-laws' house. And, to the extent that I didn't get any of those details right, please correct them. But it's such a great story. It's such an inspiring story. It's almost an archetypal story of like, putting it all on the line for your art. But I guess my specific question to you about that is, what do you think other writers should take from that? There's so many people out there, Matthew, as you know, that like they are stuck, and so many people nurse this dream of giving it all up as you did and becoming a writer. And the last thing before you answer that I want to say is, like, to me, that's a story about a great marriage as much as anything.
Yes.
Your wife being like, let's go, homie. Like, I'm calling your bluff. We're selling the house. We're going to make this happen. I mean, what a great story.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was teaching, and one of the things I was telling my students, who were all, for the most part, pretty privileged kids, in one of the best high schools in New Jersey, maybe the country. And they were all trying to get into the best Ivy League schools. And, they were all being pushed into the math and sciences because that's where the money was. And I was saying, if you want to be a writer, do that. If you want to be a poet or a dancer, if you want to be a banker, that's great too. But, do the thing that you want to do. And I thought to myself, well, I really want to be a writer, and yet I'm not doing that. Like, I'm such a hypocrite, And so again, I think it was, a lot of people might say, oh, it was so brave of you to quit your job and do this. But at the time, I was privately having this mental breakdown, and it was kind of a last-ditch effort to save myself. It didn't feel like bravery at the time. It felt like I was drowning and I was looking for some air. And my wife was amazing. And, we caught a break. The house had appreciated. So, we were able to make a little money that I paid my MFA off on. And I started writing. And, those years in the basement, in my in-laws' basement, it was an unfinished basement. It was this dank basement. My mother-in-law would swear I was going to get sick from mold. And it was not glamorous down there, but it was my little cave that I went into for 3 years. And it was really, really lonely. And everyone thought I had gone insane. Everyone, my friends, my family, nobody thought that this was going to work out except for my wife. And so I think the thing to take from that is, if you want to be a writer, maybe the best thing you could get is a really good life partner who supports what you're doing. The other thing I would say too is that it's not prescriptive. If you sell your house and move in with your in-laws, this doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a book contract. But I think the thing, again, there's a cost. Are you going to pay the cost? And I hear novelists say things to me, all would-be novelists say things all the time, like, "Oh, I can't get an agent." I say, how many people did you query? "Oh, 3." I said, I queried like 130 agents when I pitched. It was like I did it for 4 months. That's all I did, And so it's like there's a cost that you have to pay, and it's so competitive. The fiction world it's so daunting because it's so hard to make a living as a fiction writer, let alone just publish a book. And so I think that being realistic about what you're trying to do, and seeing the fantasy, but also making it a reality by being humble enough to do the things, to submitting to a process that's going to take you to a place, and there's going to be some times where you're tested, living in with my in-laws, God bless them and thank you for that. And, it was a nice place. It was a pool in the backyard. So it wasn't like it was poverty or anything like that. So I realized how privileged I was. But has anyone ever tried to live with their in-laws for 3 years? Like as great as they are, is a cost you have to pay. And it was humbling too, just as a man, who had owned my own house and, could pay my own bills, to have to accept that gift, which was an amazing gift. And I'm very, very, very grateful for it. But it took humility to live with them for 3 years and to keep going. I remember walking down those steps every day and going around the pillar and saying, I've got to do this again. And I can't give up. And it was just going around on the cold floor of that basement and sitting down at that desk every day for 3 years and not knowing if anything would work out, and watching my bank account go down, 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 all the way to nothing, and just having nothing to show for it for those years. And it was amazing that things worked out. It was kind of at the last moment and I think about the timing, because our bank accounts had gone all the way down. We'd worn out our welcome. And that's when I got my first contract. And sometimes I think, I don't know, I think the universe tests you, and sees how far you're willing to go for these things. But I do think that the key message for a young novelist out there is there's a cost, and are you willing to pay it? Because there's going to be someone out there like me that's going to pay that cost. And so you need to be able to pay it too, because you're in competition with everyone. And, my attitude was always, I might not be the most talented writer, but I'm going to outwork everybody else. That was kind of my grind attitude. I'm going to, in the MFA, you're supposed to write 1 novel. I wrote 4. They weren't good. Like, they weren't publishable, but I was doing it every day. I was trying to just do as much as I could to pay that cost.
I feel nourished right now. I feel both nourished, and I feel like ready to go out and run a marathon and like fight a heavyweight fight. I mean, this is really good stuff. Really good stuff.
Cool. I'm glad.
So why don't we go to just a few audience questions? We'll just pop them up on screen here.
Great.
Amy, thank you for that comment. By the way, while you were giving that speech, I saw our viewer numbers were just ticking up and up. It was like the whole universe knew that this was the story to listen to right now. Okay.
Cool.
Did you, Renee, thank you for this question. How did you celebrate the completion of We Are the Light?
Wow, I have to remember. I remember going down to my wife and probably just giving her a long hug. I'm not big on celebrations anymore. I remember my old writing mentor, Rowan Marullo, he always used to advise me to buy something nice for yourself to, kind of memorialize the occasion. But I think now I agree with that. I think that's a good thing to do. Rowan advised me well. But I think now it's really just, I like to sit with the novel and not show it to anyone else. So it can just be mine for a little bit before I let it go, before my wife reads it or before my agent reads it, just to sit with that story and let it live internally with me for a while. And I think I did that. I don't think I let Alicia read it for a couple of weeks after I had written the book. I actually just finished my next novel this past weekend, and I'm sitting that, like, my big reward is knowing that it's done and no one else has read it. It's only mine. And to me, as an introvert, that is very delightful to have that, and to have that moment where I created something and it just lives inside of me. And I'm very eager to show it to people, and I want to share that. But I think my reward is just getting to have it as mine for a little bit.
Beautiful. All right, let's do one more question. This is from the great author Jenna Blum. Matthew, whoops. Here's an audience question, actually. That was just a comment from Jenna. Any chance the Good Luck of Right Now is moving to the big screen?
Well, Good Luck Right Now had this very strange story. You know, it was Steven Spielberg and Dayton and Ferris were developing it. It had all of these stars attached. But it had this very famous Hollywood kind of burnout too, where all of the stars and Steven Spielberg and the director just could not agree on anything. And then it just went away. And I was hired to write a pilot for a TV show with the Good Luck of Right Now, which was fun for a while and it was good. And that didn't go either. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen to that. It could come back around. But what I've learned in Hollywood is that the ways of Hollywood are strange and mysterious, and you cash the checks when they come, and nothing else is guaranteed. You just don't know. But all of my projects are, all my books are in various degrees of Hollywoodness. So we'll see.
I thought it was interesting that the Hollywood Reporter called you one of the 25 most powerful authors in Hollywood, and you live in North Carolina, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's like a grammatically incorrect. But yeah, I don't know. That was a while ago. That's lived in my bio for a while, and everyone's like, keep that in there. So I don't know if that's currently true anymore, or if it was ever true. But it's a nice thing to have in your bio.
Do you think a book like We Are the Light might make it to the screen one day?
I would love to see it. Yeah, I mean, we're working on it. I think it would be a really powerful film. I mean, I feel like all of my books are cinematic. They're movies in my mind, so I think but it's just such a love song to cinema. I would love to sit in a theater and watch that film. I think it would be very, very beautiful. And I love movies about movie making, like Cinema Paradiso. I love that film. I always like that kind of almost meta feel of seeing it, the art being made in the film. Is very beautiful to me.
And frankly, it's a topic this country really needs to learn how to figure out how to talk about. It's the kind of thing that we don't seem quite ready to have the language for. Like if you look at obviously it's a very different thing, but the way that race in the last several years has just become a topic that everybody needs to know how to talk about. Everybody needs to be on it. And I think as a country, we've made some great steps there in race literacy, but gun violence, school shootings, mass shootings, the country just doesn't seem ready yet. And maybe a film that can do it with heart and do it with this kind of tone is maybe an entry point for some people.
Well, I think one of the things that the book really celebrates, and I hope all of my work celebrates, is getting people out of a thinking state, which is important, but into a feeling state. And I think that when we have responses to problems in society, be it about race or, gun violence or whatever, I think there's a tendency to kind of split. There's a camp that really wants to establish power, and there's a camp that really wants to establish love. And I think that both of those camps are super important. They're both necessary, and we shouldn't demonize either. But I think sometimes lately we forget about that love category, and I think that there's something inside of all of us as humans. When we can deal with the power in the right way, we can get back to the love. And I think that there's something inside of us that aches for that. And I think that most of our problems in society really do come down to a question of love. How are we loving people? How are we loving the young men in the world? And I think one of the things that's really important about the film is that there is one young man who shoots people, and there's another young man in the book who shoots films. What is the difference between those two young men? One of them knew love and the other one didn't. And I think that is something that we would all do really well to think about and meditate on, because I think we all want the same thing. We want to be loved. We want to feel like we're supported. We want to feel like we have the opportunities as anyone else has. And I think that those things are universal yearnings. And so I think that there's really a way through that feeling function to connect with everyone. And again, not that the politics and the power is not important. Of course, that's important. That's a really important conversation to have. But this conversation about love, I think, is one that needs to be happening simultaneously and just as loud.
Wonderful, Matthew. Well, folks, the book is called We Are the Light. And as always, I'm going to end with the question that I always end on, which is, Matthew, just imagine, if you could, the ideal reader for We Are the Light. And this is a person who's just receiving the book in just the way that you wished it would be received on your best day. And just imagine that ideal reader has now finished the book and it's sitting in their lap and they look out the window. And tell me in a phrase or even a word, what is the feeling that that reader has at that moment?
I am worthy of receiving love, and I'm worthy of giving love.
That's wonderful. That's great. I feel that, Matthew. I tell you, a lot of people in the comments are just saying, thank you for the inspirational talk. Thank you for exploring these issues. Thank you for your honesty. I mean, all the kind of things that people say on Goodreads about your work. And it really has just been a kind of rich, moving hour we've just spent here. So thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And you were so warm and insightful with the questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. All right. Well, look, a thoughtful bro of all thoughtful bros right here on the show. Matthew Quick, We Are the Light. It's out today. Please,
Yeah.
we put it in the comments, ways to buy it. Please open up a few browsers, buy some for yourself and your friends. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And Matthew, thank you again for coming on Thoughtful Bro.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.